The Chinese language is often credited as the biggest language in the world. And by that it means modern Standard Mandarin has more native speakers or users in the first language than any other language. However, English is a more widely spoken language by people globally, including all the people who are using English as a second language. Having said that, there is something about modern Standard Mandarin which is often understated. And that is, modern Standard Mandarin that we know today is a relatively young language. It is even less than 100 years old. And in today's video, we are going to look at the meandering path that Chinese took from literary Chinese towards what we have today as modern Standard Mandarin. Sounds interesting? Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel, and we are continuing our series on the history of Chinese languages. Before I go any further, I want to tell you a little bit about my website, which is Penang Travel Tips, because it has a section on Penang Hokkien, and now I'm also establishing a section on the history of China or Chinese languages. So I'm going to put the link here. In this particular section, I'm going to put down all the articles which I have compiled. This is my research notes for creating these videos. So if you want to go further into the research that I've done, then the research is going to be there, the articles are going to be there, and so you can go through them, including some of the material which I may not have used in any videos. Maybe in future I might, but I have not used in the videos, so I plan to put them all in the research notes in my website with the URL as you can see over here. And now back to our topic, which is the path taken from literary Chinese to modern Standard Mandarin. And I have to tell you, this is a major monumental accomplishment by China, because you are talking about the largest language in the world, the language spoken by more native speakers than any other language. That China was able to accomplish this is nothing short of extraordinary, because modern Standard Mandarin that we know today is a relatively new language. It is newer than English, French, and so on. If you dial back time to the 19th century, English as written in the 19th century, we can read it already. But if you dial back time to Chinese in the 19th century was written in literary Chinese, and it will be much more challenging to read that. It's a very complex, concise way of communicating, and that is one of the reasons why they created modern Standard Mandarin. There is so much to cover in today's video. We are going to look at literacy rates. With the introduction of modern Standard Mandarin, literacy skyrocketed. According to China's Ministry of Education, the survey done in the year 2020, now 80% of Chinese population is able to speak modern Standard Mandarin. Yeah, 80%. That is to say, 20% comprises minorities who continue to use their minority tongues such as Tibetan, Uyghur, Chuang, and what else? Mongolian. So those are the minority languages that are continuing to exist. And literacy rate in China has also skyrocketed. 95% of people who are literate in China are able to recognize and read Chinese characters in modern Standard Mandarin. Again, I said 95%. That means 5% are only able to do it in other writing systems such as Tibetan, Mongolian, and so on. But what is astonishing is that when the People's Republic of China was formed, only 20% of the population were literate. So can you see from 20% it has skyrocketed to now 80%, and literacy is at 95% of those who are able to speak modern standard Mandarin. And if you go back in time to the 19th century, then only about 1% of the population is able to read and write literary Chinese. So by phasing out literary Chinese and adopting modern standard Mandarin, China has accomplished something completely extraordinary. And today we are going to look at how they accomplish it. But because this is such a large subject, I will start by allowing the two podcasters in the China podcast, James and Jessica, do their explanation. And once again, as you know, this Notebook LM podcasters are not fluent in Mandarin, so they are going to mutilate some of the words. But I hope you tolerate that for the information that I put together to share with you. And then after that, I will come back and go through with you closely how we move from literary Chinese to modern standard Mandarin, and we are going to look at what are the characteristics of modern standard Mandarin. To be clear, modern standard Mandarin, although is something which I said is new, the ingredients to make modern standard Mandarin has always been around, such as the Beijing dialect, such as the Nanjing dialect, because the Mandarin language has always been around as the vernacular language, as the Baihua, okay, the vernacular language. And in different parts of northern China, there will be different variants of the Mandarin language. So those are the different dialects. However, it was the Beijing dialect that was chosen. And we are going to look at why Beijing dialect was chosen and what is the characteristic of modern standard as reflected in the Beijing dialect. And also we are going to look at the differences between modern standard Mandarin and literary Chinese. And finally, we are going to look at another contender to be standard Chinese. So when they were discussing and debating how to put together more language that's going to be the national language of China, they did consider different possibility. And one of those possibilities is also to consider maybe what about Cantonese. We are going to look at that as well later on. But first, let's go into the China podcast.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be diving deep into something I think you'll find fascinating: the evolution of Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how a language spoken by over 1 billion people today evolved from, what was once primarily used by scholars and officials.
It really highlights how languages are living things, constantly changing and adapting.
Right. And to guide our deep dive, we'll be drawing on excerpts from the transition from literary Chinese to modern standard Mandarin.
I'm really curious about how Mandarin made that jump from the elite to the everyday, how it became the language of so many people.
Well, we have to start way back with literary Chinese. Imagine a language so formal and rooted in ancient texts, it was almost like a sacred code.
Literary Chinese. Sounds intense.
It was. Incredibly concise, too. Used mostly for official documents, scholarly work, that sort of thing.
I can see how that would make it pretty different from how people actually spoke.
Oh, totally different. Just to give you an example, think about a simple phrase like, "Have you eaten?" In literary Chinese, that would be something like, "Already partake of nourishment."
Wow. Not exactly something you'd say casually.
No, definitely not. And that kind of gap between the written language and spoken language created a real divide,
Between those who could read literary Chinese and those who couldn't.
Exactly. It was a language of power and prestige, but it was inaccessible to most people.
So how did that change? That system must run into some problems, especially when China started to modernize.
You're right. Around the late Qing dynasty and into the early Republic of China, there was a growing need for a unified spoken language. You had widespread illiteracy and all these regional dialects that made communication difficult.
Makes sense. That's a huge barrier to things like national unity and development.
Exactly. And that's when reformers started advocating for a standardized language. They knew literary Chinese was too complex, too far removed from everyday speech.
So what did they do? Try to invent a whole new language from scratch?
Well, there was an attempt to create a hybrid language, pulling bits and pieces from different dialects.
A hybrid language.
Interesting. Ambitious, for sure. But it just didn't work. It felt too artificial to people, like something made up in a lab.
I can see how that would be tough to get people on board with. So what happened next?
They realized they needed a more practical approach, and that meant choosing one of the existing dialects as the basis for the standard.
So the big question was, which dialect?
Exactly. There was a lot of debate. Some people thought the Nanjing dialect should be the standard because of its historical significance.
I can see why. Nanjing was a major cultural center for a long time.
Right. It had been the capital of several dynasties. But then in 1913, the National Language Unification Conference was held, and things shifted.
So what did they decide?
The Beijing dialect was chosen, and that decision was deeply connected to the political landscape at the time.
Because Beijing was the capital.
Right. Making its dialect a natural choice for a national standard. It was practical and, kind of symbolic too. They started calling it Guyu, meaning national language.
National language. That definitely has a weight to it.
Oh.
But I thought it's called Putonghua now.
You're right, it was later renamed. And that change tells a really interesting story about evolving ideas of language and national identity. But we'll have to dive into that in the next part of our deep dive. So that shift from Guayu to Putonghua, it's a really interesting story.
It is, yeah. Putonghua means common speech, right?
Right, common speech. And that change in name, well, it reflects a pretty big shift in how people thought about standardized language.
How so?
Well, we talked about Guoyu having that strong sense of national identity, but
Yeah.
after the People's Republic of China was established, there was this move toward unity and inclusivity,
Okay.
and Putonghua fit that idea better,
So it was less about promoting a specific national identity
Exactly.
and more about creating a common ground for communication across different backgrounds.
Exactly. It was like saying, this language, it belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
It's a tool to understand each other better.
Right.
But then you have Taiwan.
Oh, right. Taiwan still uses the term Goyu.
They do.
Why is that?
It's because of their unique history, you see.
Okay.
Because of their connection to the Republic of China, that term Goyu stuck around.
Interesting. So even though they chose a standard, rolling it out across a huge country like China must have been a massive task.
It was. We're talking education campaigns, textbooks, dictionaries,
Wow.
even radio broadcasts spreading the word about this new standard.
It sounds like they were really committed to this.
They were. It wasn't just about making communication easier, though.
Right.
Unified language, they saw that as crucial for national unity.
Yeah.
Economic development, education, all these important things.
If people can't understand each other.
Exactly. It's harder to work together, share ideas, build a strong nation.
Makes sense. Would you say they were successful? I mean, did it work?
It did. Putonghua is the official language of mainland China now.
Wow.
Government, education, media, you name it.
So that means regional dialects are gone.
Not at all. China still has an amazingly diverse linguistic landscape.
So it's more like Putonghua is this common thread, connecting people from different regions,
Yeah, a great way to put it.
while those regional variations still exist.
Well, it's a dynamic situation, really. The standard language and these dialects constantly influencing each other.
Fascinating. It really shows how language is always evolving. Did adopting Putonghua change anything else about Chinese culture besides how people spoke?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest changes was literacy rates.
Right. I remember you said literary Chinese was really hard to learn.
Incredibly difficult.
So with Putonghua, did reading and writing become easier?
Much easier. It became accessible to so many more people.
That's huge. Did that lead to any other big shifts in Chinese society, I mean?
Definitely. Increased literacy meant more people could participate in education, public life, and literature change, too.
How so?
Writers started using Putonghua to create new forms of expression, reflecting the lives of everyday people. A real literary renaissance.
That's incredible. So this shift in language opened up all these new possibilities.
Exactly. And the impact went beyond just literature.
Yeah.
Think about theater, music, film. All these art forms were influenced.
Wow, the ripples from this change were huge. Language and culture are so closely tied together.
They are. And it makes you think, how will this incredible story of adaptation and evolution continue? What new chapters are waiting to be written in the story of Mandarin?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it, like how Mandarin went from, scholars and officials to like a billion people.
And it's not over yet. I mean, think about how China's growing in the world.
Right.
And its language is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, like in business and stuff.
Business, diplomacy, education, you name it.
I've even heard of like elementary schools in other countries offering Mandarin now.
Exactly. Knowing Mandarin opens up all these opportunities, and that's only going to increase.
It makes me wonder, though, will we see, like, more variations of Mandarin with all this global interaction?
It's possible.
I mean, we already talked about mainland China and Taiwan.
Right. And Singapore, Malaysia.
Yeah. They all have their own kind of flavors of Mandarin.
Think of it like adding spices to a dish.
Oh, I like that.
The core ingredients stay the same, but the flavor changes depending on what you add.
So even though there's a standard form, we could see it evolving in tons of different directions as it spreads globally.
Exactly. It's fascinating.
It is. And then there's technology, too. The internet, social media.
Oh yeah, huge impact.
All shaping how Mandarin is used and evolves.
Think about all the new slang terms, abbreviations, even emojis.
It's crazy how something like an emoji can have so much meaning in a language. Languages are so adaptable.
They are, constantly reflecting the changing world around us.
So who knows what's next for Mandarin? Will AI change everything? Will new dialects pop up as people blend their languages? Lots to think about.
It really is. So much potential for change and adaptation.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible. We went from ancient literary Chinese to Mandarin in the digital age.
It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you. I hope our listeners enjoyed it too.
Me too. So as we wrap up, what's like the one key takeaway you hope people remember about the Chinese language?
I'd say this. Language is never static. It's always changing. And it's a reflection of us, how we think, how we connect with each other. And as the world keeps changing, we can be sure that Mandarin, just like all languages, will keep evolving right along with it.
China began the 20th century like a Tower of Babel because the entire nation was speaking a multitude of languages. Every region, every province was using its own language. It's all fine until the invention of telecommunication devices. After 1,000 years of living in relative bliss with their system, which is using literary Chinese to communicate among themselves, suddenly the invention of telecommunication devices such as the telephone, such as radio, shows the weakness of that 1,000-year-old system. You can't talk to each other. The people in Beijing cannot talk to the one in Guangzhou, and the one in Guangzhou cannot talk to the one in Fuzhou, and so on. So they need to do something about it. So they were already thinking about doing that. And then in 1912, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed and was replaced by the Republic of China. And with the new government coming in, there was a task force that was set up, and it's called the Commission for the Unification of Pronunciation, later to be known as the National Language Commission. And this task force was given 2 goals and 3 options. The 2 goals are, firstly, to get everybody speaking the same language. And the second goal is to increase literacy, because China entered the 20th century with only 1% of the population being literate. And literacy for all the hundreds and thousands of years has been with only the elites. The rest of the commoners cannot read and write. They can look at temple and look at inscription, and it is meaningless to them. So they want to change the whole thing so that for the sake of telecommunication, everybody can read and write. Literacy is a must. So what do they do about that? They have these 3 options. So the first option is, why don't we give pronunciation, a standard pronunciation for literary Chinese, and teach it to everybody? So that is option number 1. Option number 2 is an idealistic option, which is, why don't we create a language with ingredients drawn from all the different Chinese languages, all the different languages of China? So that is option number 2. Option number 3 is, why don't we use an existing vernacular language and give it a written system? So that is option number 3. So let's dial back to option number 1. Why don't we take literary Chinese, give it a standard pronunciation, and teach it to everybody? But immediately nobody wants that, because literary Chinese is difficult and sometimes it's context dependent. So you could be dwelling on a sentence for a while, trying to understand what the sentence is trying to say, because the sentences are often concise. It doesn't have sufficient information in it that can give you immediate information. So when you put together a language, you need the language. And this is something which I learned also as I work on Penang Hokkien. You need a writing system and a language that can communicate immediately. And that is the whole purpose of language and writing system, to be able to communicate immediately. And literary Chinese, although it has been used for so long, although it appears so elegantly and in poems and in so many contexts, it is regarded as impractical. Up until then, the literary Chinese exists, but different groups of people would pronounce it his own way, in his own literary reading. And so if you were to sweep away all those different literary readings and maybe adopt Mandarin literary reading for for literary Chinese, and that is exactly what is being done in schools nowadays. If you enter into Form 4 and so on, and you read the classical Chinese poems and so on, you will be reading it in the Mandarin literary reading, not in the Hokkien literary reading or Teochew literary reading. You'll be reading in the Mandarin literary reading, because Mandarin is the first written Chinese language that you learned. You did not learn to read it in Hokkien literary reading and so on. So students in Malaysia would be reading it in the Mandarin literary reading. But this is not an accomplishment that they desire. They find that this is too complex, too complicated, and it's going to stifle literacy across China. So, first option, put aside. Now, let's go to the second option. Second option is, let's be very, very democratic and create a whole new language with ingredients from every existing language. But the result is not every existing language. Once again, Beijing dialect, being the language of the capital, gets prominence as the main ingredients of this artificial language that they are creating. This artificial language, now we call it as the Old National Pronunciation. So the Old National Pronunciation is a pronunciation based on Beijing dialect, but also different other Mandarin dialects from northern China, and even Wu language. Wu language, that means Cantonese. So a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and everybody is happy? No, everybody is not happy. Nobody likes that either, because this is an artificial language. And they even publish a dictionary of this. So the task force that was given the task of creating a national language, they published a dictionary in the year 1919 called the Dictionary of National Pronunciation, and they rolled out this pronunciation, which is an artificial pronunciation that has a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it means everybody has to learn it that way, and nobody wants to learn it that way. So this out it goes again. And then so it's back to the drawing board, and different languages were looked at, and eventually Beijing dialect was selected to be the basis. When we say Beijing dialect, that means the language, the vernacular language or the spoken language in Beijing. As you know, throughout China, different languages are spoken, and so we just call it as dialect. So Hokkien, in Fujian province, you will have the Zhangzhou dialect, you will have the Quanzhou dialect or the Xiamen dialect, and also Fuzhou would have Fuzhou dialect, and so on. But for the sake of the national language, they chose the Beijing dialect as the main basis, the basis on which to put the writing system. So a writing system was established for the Beijing dialect. It doesn't mean that prior to this, Beijing dialect has never been written down before. It could be written, especially if you were literate, if you learn literary Chinese, then of course you will also be able to learn some words that is used in the vernacular. But as I mentioned earlier, only 1% of the population is literate. So whether it is writing in literary Chinese or in vernaculars, the vernacular languages or dialects, it is always the game of the elites. The rest of the population, the rest 99% of the population is left in the dark, and they remain in the dark until the elites finally turn the lights on for them. So anyway, this is the game for the elites. And the elites chose that we would use the Beijing dialect, and finally option 3 was chosen. And in the year 1932, they finally established and published a dictionary that produces the vocabulary in the new national pronunciation. That is to say, pronunciation according to the Beijing dialect. And next, we are going to look at the characteristic of this Beijing dialect with the national pronunciation, and this forms what becomes known as modern Standard Mandarin. We will look at the characteristic of modern Standard Mandarin. After that, we are going to look at the differences between modern Standard Mandarin and classical literary Chinese. I'm going to use the word literary Chinese rather than classical Chinese here. I'll say literary Chinese. And finally, the other contender to be Standard Chinese, which is Cantonese. Okay? So, first of all, modern Standard Mandarin is derived from the Beijing dialect. And what is the characteristic? First of all, the phonology. The phonology of Beijing dialect is it has 4 tones. And these 4 tones are, in a sense, simpler than some other languages, Chinese languages. Also, the tone sandhi of Beijing dialect is simpler than, for example, Hokkien. Hokkien's tone sandhi is very complex, and I know because I am trying to teach people Hokkien language and I'm trying to teach them, I'm simplifying the rules of tone sandhi in order to make it easy for people to learn Hokkien. But when you compare it with Beijing dialect has only 4 tones, and the tone sandhi is much simpler. And the next thing is vocabulary. The lexicon of Beijing dialect is used heavily when creating modern Standard Mandarin. But for the purpose of inclusivity, they also use expressions and words from other Mandarin dialects to create this modern Standard Mandarin. And another thing is writing system. Writing system initially is in the traditional Chinese characters, but over time, the People's Republic of China adopted simplified Chinese. That itself is a video of its own. We'll cover that separately. As for the word order or grammar, the word order or grammar for the Beijing dialect is quite simple, which is SVO, subject, verb, and object. So this SVO word order is one of the simplest word order that is found in most languages of the world, the SVO, subject, verb, object. And so this makes the Beijing dialect a major contender or to be the national language of China or modern Standard Mandarin. Next, comparison with literary Chinese, and there are 4 points here. Number 1 is accessibility. Literary Chinese is difficult to learn and it requires specialized education. And even people who learn it, not all of them are going to learn it well and become fluent in it. So it is something which is unnecessary. If there's something easier to learn, for the sake of communication, let's learn something that is easier. Second is syntax. Literary Chinese is concise, is brief, and it packs a lot into it. But also it is dependent on your knowledge of perhaps classical idioms and the minimal use of grammatical markers. So this is something which is difficult for everyday use. So that is the comparison between modern Standard Mandarin and literary Chinese. I'm looking at my notes here. Another comparison is phonological relation. So literary Chinese does not have a fixed pronunciation system. As mentioned already, in Beijing, they will be pronouncing literary Chinese in the Beijing literary reading. In Fujian province, they will be pronouncing in the Hokkien literary reading, and so on. So everywhere will pronounce literary Chinese in his own way. So that is the Tower of Babel when China entered the 20th century. And finally, the purpose, literary Chinese is elegant, is great for philosophical writings. But for everyday use, China needs something that is versatile. And what is more versatile than literary Chinese is modern Standard Mandarin based on the Beijing dialect. And finally, we look at other contenders to be Standard Chinese, and one of them is Cantonese. Yes, Cantonese is a very culturally rich language that is used in the southern part of China, and in the beginning of their search for a national language, they do think about what about Cantonese, but it is not seriously considered for practical reasons. One of the practical reasons is that the bureaucrats are all in Beijing, so quite honestly, they are choosing something that is more practical to them. So geographically and demographically, Cantonese is the language of southern China and is very distant and foreign to the people in Beijing. So it is not practical to learn this particular language. Secondly, the pronunciation, the tones of Cantonese is more complex than Mandarin. So if your goal is to increase literacy and to have everybody learn the same language, they want to choose something that is the easiest for everybody to learn. And for that reason, although Cantonese was at one point thought about or considered, it was eventually bypassed in favor of the Beijing dialect, and from that we learn that Beijing dialect becomes modern Standard Mandarin. And so there we have it, the journey from literary Chinese to modern Standard Mandarin. And I hope that through this video, we can open up some discussion, and feel free to write your comments and so on. Maybe you have knowledge about this that I do not have. And once again, I have to say that this is based on what I researched. I could be wrong. And if I am, please point it out to me in a courteous way so that we can all learn together. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like so that YouTube will show it to more people. And of course, to follow me on more of my videos, please subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel. And at the same time, visit the link which I'm putting here for articles or the research materials which is in written form, which you can also go through, that covers different aspects of what I am putting together in video. So I want to thank you so much for joining me in this video. I look forward to having you again in the next one. And until then, 感謝盧姐姐。